think I'm live. Oh, here we go. I see my face. All right. So, hi everyone. My name is CJ. I'm one of the members of the Smart Brown Girl Syllabi Co-hort, which is basically just a group of us who have a relationship to the readings, the writings, the scholarship of it all, and like to talk about it. That's the most expansive definition I can offer of that, because we all come from very different disciplines and relationships to school, academia, and all that stuff. But I think that captures like all the very diverse interests and relationships. But hello, I want this to be a really informal conversation about theory, maybe even mildly, cathartic, because I think it can be really hard to think about where a relationship is to theory when it has such its hooves in, at least for me, everything I hate about academia. And during the activity of reading theory, it always feels like, Black women especially, but all types of people who are not white cis men are arriving at the text always and already insufficient. And I think in our pursuit for information, for knowledge, it can feel like, what am I striving for, and this is a challenge I kind of come up against all the time, trying to diversify my reading strategy so I can better understand what, insert French philosopher is trying to say. And the kind of logic in the back of my mind is always like, what the hell, like, why am I doing this? Is this fruitful for me? And that's a broader question that you kind of have to evaluate for yourself. But something that always feels important is trying to think about why it is that I feel maybe inadequate while reading these texts. And so I'm encouraging everyone to read The Race for Theory. And so I put the link in the description for the chat, but I will also post it again in the Facebook comments. That should be, yes, okay. That is the link to the text. And I want to do a bit of a read along because Barbara Christian makes a lot of great points. But there might also be some references to things that, warrant explaining a little bit further. But as people are coming into the chat or, coming into the discussion, I'm curious to hear what your impressions are of theory when you hear theory, because I think a lot of times, especially right now, the cohort and the book club is thinking a lot about why is it that people perhaps aren't engaging the grouping called complex theory, and why that title is perhaps so contentious for a lot of people. And, as a book club that's oriented towards Black women, we don't want to reinscribe the same kind of burden of Black women arrive to theory already, always inadequate, and unprepared to tackle big ideas. And so, Yeah, I think Barbara Christian really lays out really nicely how that relationship happens and how a kind of Black literary theory gets lost within what she calls the race for theory. Um, so yeah, again, and I'll type it as a question. Okay, so I just put it in the chat, so that could be like a grounding question for people. I'm going to start reading. So it's called The Race for Theory by Barbara Christian, who is herself is a professor critically analyzing Black literature. So she says, I have seized this occasion to break the silence among those of us, critics, as we are now called, who have been intimidated, devalued by what I call the race for theory. I have become convinced that there has been a takeover in the literary world by Western philosophers from the old literary elite, the neutral humanists. Philosophers have been able to effect such a takeover because so much of the literature of the West has become pallid, laden with despair, self-indulgent, and disconnected. The new philosophers, eager to understand a world that is today fast escaping their political control, have redefined literature so that the distinctions implied by that term, that is, the distinctions between everything written and those things written to evoke feeling as well as to express thought, have been blurred. They have changed literary critical language to suit their own purposes as philosophers, and they have reinvented the meaning of theory. My first response to this realization was to ignore it. Perhaps in spite of the egocentrism of this trend, some good might come of it. I felt, more pressing and interesting things to do, such as reading and studying the history and literature of Black women. A history that had been totally ignored, a contemporary literature bursting with originality, passion, insight, and beauty. But unfortunately, it is difficult to ignore this new takeover, since theory has become a commodity which helps determine whether we are hired or promoted in academic institutions. Worse, whether we are heard at all. Due to this new orientation, works, a word that evokes labor, have become texts. Critics are no longer concerned with literature, but with other critics' texts, for the critic yearning for attention has displaced the writer and has conceived of himself as the center. Interestingly, in the first part of this century, at least in England and America, the critic was usually also a writer of poetry, plays, or novels. But today, as a new generation of professionals develops, he or she is increasingly an academic. She doesn't use quotes. I did that for added emphasis. I say emphasis mine, as you would write in a text. Activities such as teaching or writing one's response to specific works of literature have, among this group, become subordinated to one primary thrust, that moment when one creates a theory, thus fixing a constellation of ideas for a time at least, a fixing which no doubt will be replaced in another month or so by somebody else's competing theory as the race accelerates. So I'm going to pause here quickly. Just to hit on a couple of things that she's talking about. So here she's talking about the turn from works to text and literary criticism to being an academic, right? And so one of the things that she notes is that in the earlier 20th century, a lot of times when people are writing literary criticism, or as this field is kind of like emerging, the people who are writing literary criticism are also themselves people who write literature. And literary criticism, or the literary critic, kind of takes its own, presents its own occupation. And that's not to say necessarily that's good or bad, or even that she's saying that that's I mean, she might be kind of saying this a little bit, but to say that there's a particular eye towards literature that happens when you also create it, right? And Toni Morrison also talks about this in her nonfiction writing. She writes a couple of like literary critical essays in the around the same time that not too long after Barbara Christian is writing, she is very explicit about the fact that she's writing from the position of a writer who is reading and not from a literary critic. And that's a distinction that Barbara Christian right here is kind of making, of those are very different dispositions to have when looking at and evaluating literature. And so this idea of the academic, the new philosopher, it's not something that's entirely lost on us currently. I think, academic Twitter is a thing. And orientations or fixations on the way that a particular tradition of looking at literature is propped up or privileged, if you would say, as opposed to the actual subject matter, or, the workings of the actual text or work, as she says. And yeah, she's hitting on a couple of things about, there being a lot of ego involved in, pushing theory in this very particular way. And in a way that doesn't serve the literature that she wants to do, the literature that she wants to study, which is about Black women. And the last thing, she talks frequently about Western philosophy, which you could just think of as white guy philosophy. But she's talking about when people say Western, they don't actually, it doesn't necessarily imply a West. It's more of a, because obviously, unless you're, BOB, you know that we live on a globe and it's a sphere. So if you go west, you just keep going west. But anyways, the point being that it's more of a conceptual thinking of the West. And then, if you ask someone who studies this, they would say then there's the East. But thinking about Western philosophy as the means of privileging a very particular kind of thinking that is just white guy philosophy. Okay, so I'm going to continue reading. Let's see. So she says, perhaps because those who have effected the takeover have the power, although they deny it, first of all, to be published and thereby to determine the ideas which are deemed valuable, some of our most daring and potentially radical critics, and by our, I mean Black women, third world, have been influenced, even co-opted into speaking a language and defining their discussion in terms alien to or opposed to our needs and orientation. At least so far, the creative writers I study have resisted this language. For people of color have always theorized, but in forms quite different from the Western form of abstract logic. And I am inclined to say that our theorizing, and I intentionally use the verb rather than the noun, is often in narrative forms, in the stories we create, in riddles and proverbs, in the play with language, since dynamic rather than fixed ideas seem more to our liking. And I really appreciate that part. She's distinguishing that Black women theorize, and she says that she's emphasizing the verb and less so theory, because again, as we know with our complex theory track, the very term can be intimidating, right? And it's kind of loaded and already assumes a very particular audience, a very specific stance. But she's saying the activity of theorizing is not, it's not like Black women don't do that. It just does not look in the way that theory does. And that's a very important distinction, because especially when we think about, the idea that we can't do theory or that we don't do theory. It's false, right? Okay. Oh, and also thinking about, she's talking about theory as fixed ideas. So, and she'll discuss that further. But I think also in emphasizing the verb of theorizing and not the theory, she's also talking about the fact that a lot of what we're talking about is a much more active, fluid assessment of what's happening. I mean, I'd like to think that when Brie and I did our discussion of Octavia Butler, that we were in there also theorizing, if not pontificating, on how Octavia Butler is potentially theorizing Black women and affect and care. That's happening in speculative fiction, right? In science fiction. So that activity of creating theory, no, let me do justice to Barbara Christian. In the activity of theorizing, Black women are there, and Black narrative is doing that. It just doesn't look in the particular ways that Western philosophy does it. Okay, so I'll continue. How else have we managed to survive with such spiritedness, the assault on our bodies, social institutions, countries, our very humanity? And women, at least the women I grew up around, continuously speculated about the nature of life through pithy language that unmasked the power relations of their world. It is this language and the grace and pleasure, go check out pleasure activism, the grace and the pleasure with which they played with it that I find celebrated, refined, critiqued in the works of writers like Morrison and Walker. My folk, in other words, have always been a race for theory, though more in the form of the hieroglyph, a written figure which is both sensual and abstract, both beautiful and communicative. In my own work, I try to illuminate and explain these hieroglyphs, which is, I think, an activity quite different from the creating of the hieroglyphs themselves. As Buddhists would say, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. So again, she's just lovely. And it's like not pretentious the way that she's theorizing, to me. Perhaps by comparison. But I think it's interesting. Dr. Alicia Hines and I are working on at another article, Hortense Spillers. And it's published in the same year that this is written. And so I've, heard, at least, in classrooms, I don't know if this happened more broad, I'm sure it happened in the academy within Black Studies or literary criticism itself, but those two texts get kind of pushed alongside each other and against each other. Two Black women critics writing, and it's often placed as it being, severely oppositional, right? That Barbara Christian is condemning a type of writing that Hortense Spillers is doing. And I don't see that personally. And one of those places where I don't see that is using her terms of the use of the hieroglyph. And maybe I'd have to look at them more closely alongside each other. But Spillers refers to hieroglyphics, right? And hieroglyphics in itself is kind of a loaded term because, Black people in the US have frequently had a very fixed idea of the continent of Africa within our kind of imaginations or reconceptualizations of Blackness in the US that sometimes isn't compatible at all with the idea that, there's plenty of countries just within the continent of Africa, so there's no Pan-Africanism is hard. Anyways, my point being that what happens a lot of the time is the idealizing of Egypt or Ethiopia, like usually those two, right? Ethiopia more for like biblical subtext. But so the use of hieroglyphics, not just to say, just to think about language and linguistics, but also it kind of hits at the note of the interpretive work of these culturally important things to us, right? So hieroglyphics, Egypt, that could be a leap, but that's how I see it, right? Is thinking about the kind of cultural matter of what we know and interpret as Blackness, Black things. And so I think it's interesting that both Christian and Spillers both use the language of hieroglyphics. And I don't know if they're citing anything outside of, obviously themselves, but yeah, I'm seeing. So the name Yada Yada, that's cool. I think theory is like an opinion, but without the facts. It's the first step to finding the truth. Yeah, and I think, I think that, so theory, I definitely think of maybe literary criticism as an opinion. Although, as Barbara Christian will talk about more, like it's considered to be more fixed and I guess she calls it prescriptive, to where it's not enough to say, this is how I like to read, right? This is my process of reading. But Western philosophical theory will try and say, this is how we should read. And so theory, in the most basic sense, as I've come to understand it and people have explained it, is just, a way of knowing. And I'll send a link to it in the chat towards the end, but Judith Butler is a theorist, most notable Gender Trouble. She writes about gender, performativity, that type of stuff. And in 1999, she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in response to people like accusing her of being a bad writer because it was like very dense and very like all those things. And she responded by saying essentially that, it's hard to write about things that are so obvious, right? Like it's theory is trying to grapple with finding language for the things that we kind of just either know intuitively, phenomena that we take for granted. Like, think about if you had to explain to someone like how to walk, like from like being like standing still, not like a baby, not like teaching them, showing them, but like literally explaining the process. You would have to describe the sensation of your muscle moving as you lift up your knee. You would have to, it requires like a deep attention to the things that have either become intuitive because, we've been ingrained in that culture, or intuitive because we're talking about feelings, or, affect theory is like some of the most dense theory I've read because they're literally trying to describe the impulse of feeling, or what happens when we feel things. And that's hard, right? And so I do try to have a little bit of grace, and there is grace being given here by Barbara Christian about the fact that, you're trying to find language to that which has previously been unexpressed. And so that leads to a lot of people writing in circles, people using dense language. but a lot of times it feels unnecessary, and it feels like things are just being coded in a way to exclude the very idea that anyone outside of Western philosophical thought is reading or writing. And then here comes Barbara Christian, whose work emphasizes Black women's writing, and she's it's not that she's just finding language, but she has language for what's happening when she reads Black women's writing, but it's read as insufficient by the Academy. Yeah, and I think this is deeply important, and it's a stance that informs the very nature of Black women being read in literature and Black women reading and therefore writing about literature. But it's also deeply personal, as a very personal individual aside. I'm in a literary criticism class now, and even though I'm doing fine in the class and I am learning, which is the most important part, the feelings of this is not my home discipline, this is not for me. I don't feel served, or not that I don't feel served by it, but that, it doesn't feel intuitive for me to think or read or write in the ways that I do. It's not a coincidence that I'm the only Black person, and definitely the only Black woman in the class, So yeah, I'm going to read a little bit further, and then if anyone has any questions or thoughts on the piece, I'd love to hear them. Okay. Also, this is very experimental, and so I think everyone in the cohort, not just me, would appreciate any feedback you have. Critical feedback too. It doesn't have to be all positive, because some people might not like the kind of read along structure. People might, or if they do prefer, or enjoy the reading alongs, they might not like the frequent breaks for my footnotes. But I don't want to assume anyone has a particular awareness or experience with reading articles, especially journal articles. And so for me, as someone who likes to read theory but can be intimidated by it sometimes, for me, reading in chunks is really helpful for me. So me stopping, taking breaks between paragraphs, kind of assessing what is being said, and that kind of helps ground me into what's being said later on. But for reading out loud, that might not work for everyone. So let me see. So I ended off there, and I'll just read another page or so. So in this discussion, however, I am more concerned with the issue raised by my first use of the term, the race for theory, in relation to its academic hegemony, and possibly of its inappropriateness to the energetic emerging literatures in the world today. The pervasiveness of this academic hegemony is an issue continually spoken about, but usually in hidden groups, lest we, who are disturbed by it, appear ignorant to the reigning academic elite. So to say, we talk about it behind the scenes, amongst maybe our Black cohorts, our, peers, stuff like that. But if you object to the convention of writing super dense, incomprehensible writing, then it makes you appear as though you just don't know what you're doing. And I mentioned academic Twitter to say that, a lot of times you see this very interaction happening quite frequently, where if you say to someone, this isn't comprehensible, or it's hard to understand, then it gets turned onto you as, well, you just don't get it. And that's a personal problem. And perhaps, to some extent, the onus is on us to take our education or take the things that we want to learn and interrogate it more. But there's also a lot to be said about the fact that you could do a better job of explaining it. And by not insisting that we do better understand it, it's clear to us that the objective of what you're doing is not to help us learn or to engage with you, but it's to theorize us in circles. And who is that serving? So among the folk who speak in muted tones are people of color, feminists, radical critics, creative writers who have struggled for much longer than a decade to make their various voices heard, and for whom literature is not an occasion for discourse among critics, but is necessary nourishment for their people and one way by which they come to understand their lives better, which I like to think is an objective of our reading group. Cliched though this may be, it bears, I think, repeating here. The race for theory, with its linguistic jargon, its emphasis on quoting, its prophets, its tendency towards biblical exegesis, I hate that word, its refusal even to mention specific works of creative writers, far less contemporary ones, its preoccupations with mechanical analyses of language, graphs, algebraic equations, its gross generalizations about culture has silenced many of us to the extent that some of us feel we can no longer discuss our own literature, while others have developed intense writing blocks and are puzzled by the incomprehensibility of the language set adrift in literary circles. There have been, in the last year, any number of occasions on which I had to convince literary critics who have pioneered entire new areas of critical inquiry that they did have something to say. Some of us are continually harassed to invent wholesale theories, regardless of the complexity of the literature we study. I, for one, am tired of being asked to produce a Black feminist literary theory as if I were a mechanical man. For I believe such a theory is prescriptive. It ought to have some relationship to practice. Oh, I said it wrong earlier. So she's saying the theory should be prescriptive in that it should have practice. I was thinking her as critiquing the prescriptive language of this is how you're supposed to read from like white literary critics, but I said that wrong earlier. Since I can count on one hand the number of people attempting to be Black feminist literary critics in the world today, I consider it presumptuous of me to invent a theory of how we ought to read. Instead, I think we need to read the works of our writers in our various ways and remain open to the intricacies of the intersection of language, class, race, and gender in the literature. And I would also add just a note to say that those are not the only locations in which we can think about the nuances of literature, like thinking about class, race, gender. So I think increasingly now in our more contemporary moment, it gets that even that can get can appear as very formulaic to people, right? Like if I think of, and maybe someone will add an axis of disability, maybe, so maybe sexuality. And it would help if we share our process, and that is our practice, as much as possible, since finally our work is a collective endeavor. True. The insidious quality of this race for theory is symbolized for me by the very name of this special issue. The issue in which she's writing is called Minority Discourse. A label which is borrowed from the reigning theory of the day and is untrue to the literatures being produced by our writers, for many of our literatures, certainly Afro-American literature, are central, not minor, and by the titles of many of the articles which illuminate language as an assault on the other rather than as possible communication, and play with or even affirmation of another. I have used the passive voice, this part is kind of dense, but I'll read it anyways. I have used the passive voice in my last sentence construction, contrary to the rules of Black English, which, like all languages, has a particular value system, since I have not placed responsibility on any particular person or group. But that is precisely because this new ideology has become so prevalent among us that it behaves like so many of the other ideologies with which we have had to contend. I think that's a typo. I think that's maybe why it's so dense, because it's a typo. That's the journal's fault, not hers. It appears to have neither head nor center. At the least, though, we can say that the terms minority and discourse are located firmly in a Western dualistic or binary frame, which sees the rest of the world as minor and tries to convince the rest of the world that it is major, usually through force and then through language, even as it claims many of the ideas that we, its historical other, have known and spoken about for so long. For many of us have never conceived of ourselves only as somebody's other. So, that this is a worthwhile section. The reason I said it was dense is because she does this thing in theory where, you know, people kind of retreat back to, they use specific terms for what they're saying, and then they retreat back to that sentence to say, well, you know, just so you know, this wasn't unintended. Like I did this for a reason. And so that sometimes can feel a little disjointed. But what she's saying is basically about what I was trying to articulate earlier about the West. And it's not just specific to when people say Western thought, when people say, you know, I mean, the very idea of whiteness and blackness, you know, that there is the thing that is superior and then there is the other. And that's a common relationship. And she's saying that even the very nature of like me publishing this and it being published within a special issue called Minority Discourse, right? And so what she and other people writing within and about literary criticism, including Toni Morrison, say like, we're not, you know, minor to literary criticism, we're actually quite central to it. Actually, the very discipline and the nature of discourse is centered around what I want to talk about. You just don't want to hear me talk about it in the ways that I want to talk about it by me, the Black woman. And yeah, I think, and so she makes the point too about the fact that these others are first made so by force, by war, by colonialism, settlement, all of those things, and then by culture. So thinking of, she calls what she refers to as hegemony. So the cultural hegemony that gets imposed by language. So, you know, it's not to say, that we are not feeling the brunt of, you know, hegemony as an anti-Black pro-racism country. We're not at the period of settlement, although you could argue that's an ongoing project. But to say that we still feel those cultural logics and language, the way people talk to you, the way that you know your society is arranged, and all of those things. So I'm just gonna read a little bit further, just because she offers a bit of a historical context. But then I'm gonna end after a page. But I definitely encourage folks to continue reading this article, if nothing else, to feel affirmed in the fact that you know, we aren't removed from theorizing, right? We might be placed at a disadvantage when it comes to people writing theory, but that's because it's intentionally so, right? Like, you know, we're not precluded from that for nothing. So yeah, it's a great read. So I'll just finish this. Let me not give the impression that by objecting to the race for theory, I ally myself with or agree with the neutral humanists who see literature as pure expression and will not admit to the obvious control of its production, value, and distribution by those who have power, who deny, in other words, that literature is of necessity political. So I'll just say right here. So she's setting up in this last part that I'm going to read that literature, and therefore literary criticism, is political. But she calls on humanism at several points in this essay, particularly what she calls neutral humanism, to suggest that oftentimes humanism, and I think you hear a lot recently in academia, academic Twitter, what have you, about the emphasis on the human, and that comes from, Sylvia Winters, Spillers, Black women theorists. And I think what she's doing here is talking about the fact that our exclusion from theory essentially comes from this assumption, or it's not an assumption, of the projection that of humanism, which is to say, as she says, there's a pure sense of humanity, that we're all operating from kind of a baseline of pure expression. And she's saying that rather than think that way, which is not true because we're not all regarded in the same way, to instead consider actively the ways that literature behaves and is consumed differently by different people. So she also mentions deconstructionist thought, which is the idea that there are systems of power and play within the things that we read or we write, focusing on literary criticism. And so she's saying, rather than having to try and read something and then on the back end evaluate how systems are at play, you could just recognize that all of us approach these things differently. Because I'm a Black woman and you're a white man, we would approach these things differently, and then support the ways in which we all read differently. I hope I made that distinction clear. But it's kind of when you don't do something that you needed to do right the first time, and then you got to do all this backtrack work on the other end but you should have done it right in the first place. I think that's essentially kind of what it is, if I can reduce it to that. So for an entire century, Afro-American writers, from Charles Chesnutt in the 19th century through Richard Wright in the 1930s, Mamu Baraka in the 1960s, Alice Walker in the 1970s, have protested the literary hierarchy of dominance, which declares when literature is literature, when literature is great, depending on what it thinks is to its depending on what it thinks is to its advantage. That was a hard sentence, Barbara. The Black arts movement of the 1960s, out of which Black studies, the feminist literary movement of the 1970s, and women's studies grew, articulated precisely those issues which came not from the declarations of the new Western philosophers, but from these groups' reflections on their own lives. That Western scholars have long believed their ideas to be universal has been strongly opposed by many such groups. Some of my colleagues do not see Black critical writers of previous decades as eloquent enough. Clearly, they have not read Richard Wright's Blueprint for Negro Writing, Ralph Ellison's Shadow and Act, Chesnutt's Resignation from Being a Writer, or Alice Walker's Search for Zora Neale Hurston. There are two reasons for this general ignorance of what our writer critics have said. One is that Black writing has been generally ignored in this country. Since we, as Toni Morrison has put it, are seen as a discredited people, it is no surprise then that our creations are also discredited. But this is also due to the fact that until recent, dominant critics in the Western world have also been creative writers who have had access to the upper middle class institutions of education, and until recently, our writers have decidedly been excluded from these institutions, and in fact have often been opposed to them. Because of the academic world's general ignorance about the literature of Black people and of women, whose work too has been discredited, it is not surprising that so many of our critics think that the position arguing that literature is political begins with these new philosophers. Unfortunately, many of our young critics do not investigate the reasons why that statement, literature is political, is now acceptable when before it was not. Nor do we look to our own antecedents for the sophisticated arguments upon which we can build in order to change the tendency of any established Western idea to become hegemonic. For I feel that the new emphasis on literary critical theory is as hegemonic as the world which it attacks. I see the language it creates as one which mystifies rather than clarifies our condition, making it possible for a few people who know that particular language to control the critical scene. That language surfaced, interestingly enough, just when the literature of peoples of color, of Black women, of Latin Americans, of Africans began to move to the center. Such words as center and periphery are themselves instructive. Discourse, canon, text, words as latent as the tradition from which they come are quite familiar to me. Because I went to Catholic mission school in the West Indies, I must confess that I cannot hear the word canon without smelling incense, that the word text immediately brings back agonizing memories of biblical why does she do this to me? I hate this word. We're not doing that. I rebuke it. That discourse reeks for me of metaphysics forced down my throat in those courses that traced world philosophy from Aristotle, from Thomas Aquinas to Heidegger, who was a Nazi, and people love to quote Heidegger. But she's basically saying that these terms are very loaded for her. They have a cultural subtext and meaning for her. Periphery, too, is a word I heard throughout my childhood, for if anything was seen as being at the periphery, it was those small Caribbean islands which had neither a landmass nor military power. Still, I noted how intensely important this periphery was, for U.S. troops were continually invading one island or another if any change in political control even seemed to be occurring. As I lived among folk for whom language was an absolutely necessary way of validating our existence, I was told that the minds of the world lived only in the small continent of Europe. The metaphysical language of the new philosophy, then, I must admit, is repulsive to me and is one reason why I raced from philosophy to literature, since the latter seemed to me to have the possibilities of rendering the world as large and as complicated as I experienced it, as sensual as I knew it was. In literature, I sensed the possibility of the integration of feeling/knowledge rather than the split between the abstract and the emotional in which Western philosophy inevitably indulged. Now, I am being told that philosophers are the ones who write literature, that authors are dead, irrelevant, more vessels through which their narratives ooze, and that they do not work nor have they the faintest idea that they are doing. Let's start that sentence over. Now I am being told that philosophers are the ones who write literature, that authors are dead, irrelevant, mere vessels through which their narratives ooze, that they do not work, nor have they the faintest idea what they are doing. Rather, they produce texts as disembodied as the angels. I am frankly astonished that scholars who call themselves Marxists or post-Marxists could seriously use such metaphysical language even as they attempt to deconstruct the philosophical tradition from which their language comes. And as a student of literature, I am appalled by the sheer ugliness of the language, its lack of clarity, its unnecessarily complicated sentence constructions, its lack of pleasurableness, its alienating quality. It is the kind of writing for which composition teachers would give a freshman a resounding F. I've said this multiple times where I've read a piece of writing and been like, wow, if I was grading this, I don't know. Because I am a curious person, however, I postponed readings of Black women writers I was working on and read some of the prophets of this new literary orientation. These writers did announce their dissatisfaction with some of the cornerstone ideas of their own tradition, a dissatisfaction with which I was born. But in their attempt to change the orientation of Western scholarship, they, as usual, concentrated on themselves and were not in the slightest interested in the worlds they had ignored or controlled. Again, I was supposed to know them, while they were not at all interested in knowing me. Instead, they sought to deconstruct the tradition to which they belonged, even as they used the same form, style, language of that tradition, forms which necessarily embody its values. And increasingly, as I read them and saw their substitution of their philosophical writings for literary ones, I began to have the uneasy feeling that their folk were not producing any literature worth mentioning, for they always hearkened back to the masterpieces of the past, again reifying the very text they said they were deconstructing. Increasingly, as their way, their terms, their approaches remained central and became the means by which one defined literary critics, many of my own peers who had previously been concentrating on dealing with the other side of the equation, the reclamation and discussion of past and present third world literatures, were diverted into continually discussing the new literary theory. From my point of view as a critic of contemporary Afro-American women's writing, this orientation is extremely problematic. In attempting to find the deep structures in the literary tradition, a major preoccupation of the new criticism, many of us have become obsessed with the nature of reading itself to the extent that we have stopped writing about literature being written today. Since I am slightly paranoid, it has begun to occur to me that the literature being produced is precisely one of the reasons why this new philosophical literary critical theory of relativity is so prominent. In other words, the literature of Blacks, women of South America and Africa, etc., as overtly political literature was being preempted by a new Western concept which proclaimed that reality does not exist, that everything is relative, and that every text is silent about something, which indeed it must necessarily be. There is, of course, much to be learned from exploring how we know what we know, how we read what we read, an exploration which of necessity can have no end. But there also has to be a what. And that what, when it is even mentioned by the new philosophers, are texts of the past, primarily Western male texts, whose norms are again being transferred into third world female texts as theories of reading proliferate. Inevitably, a hierarchy has now developed between what is called theoretical criticism and practical criticism, as mind is deemed superior to matter. I have no quarrel with those who wish to philosophize. Me in words. Okay. I have no quarrel with those who wish to philosophize about how we know what we know. But I do resent the fact that this particular orientation is so privileged and has diverted so many of us from doing the first readings of the literature being written today, as well as of the past works about which nothing has been written. I know, for example, that there is little work done on Gloria Naylor, that most of Alice Walker's works have not been commented on despite the range around The Color Purple, that there has yet to be an in-depth study of Frances Harper, the 19th century abolitionist poet and novelist. If our emphasis on theoretical criticism continues, critics of the future may have to reclaim the writers we are now ignoring, that is, if they are even aware these artists exist. So I'm going to end there. It's a little over halfway of the article. But I just want to emphasize the idea that, especially when she's ending off on the section that I just read, that there's so much to be gleaned from reading, from literature, than just constantly interrogating what theory privileges as the only theory, which is how do we know what we know? And so she's saying that the heightened emphasis on that means that there's a lot of literature, a lot of great literature that gets lost. and lost in its evaluation, even by Black critics. So yeah, this conversation is probably perhaps, ongoing, but I hope that it helps to think about, interrogating theory as like an inadequacy of theory itself and not us as Black women reading. So yeah, I appreciate, y'all watching live. I also appreciate the folks who watch the streams afterwards. No judgment. I do that too sometimes. Because, sometimes you gotta be in the right headspace to discuss or watch certain things, and I get that. So yeah, I appreciate it, and I will talk to y'all another day. Bye.